Thank you. Another round of applause for Eric Wolf, please. Uh, Very important topic regarding ideas on renewable and sustainable. Also, I would like to thank Eric for allowing me to participate today, and I would like to ask you, how are you guys enjoying yourself today? Everyone's having fun, doing good stuff? Okay. A little reminder, please be sure to take full advantage of the amenities here at your FoodWorx Conference to make this an extra special experience for you. And without further ado, I'll try to find my place in here just in case I get lost. Okay, and again, thank you for staying for my small talk on space food for space tourists. Businesses, commercial companies like SpaceX, as well as XCOR and Virgin Galactic, have people on their list like Sarah Brightman, right? Yeah, okay. Sarah Brightman, Lady Gaga, and Justin Bieber, to name a few of the celebrities now on their list. And that's a commercial mission. But to define a non-commercial mission might talk to countries like the United States, Russia, Japan, Canada, for one example, and of course the International Space Station. The International Space Station is about 230 kilometers away from the sea level of the Earth, and so that's one aspect of things. But we shouldn't feel like that's an exclusive club. And so for only $40 million, a company like Space Adventures can get you a seat on a Russian Soyuz and fly you up to the ISS, where you could then earn your wings as a spaceflight participant. Now, that individual is one that's actually helping the astronauts with their various experiments in the mission, and so that's a different distinction than the space tourist. Now, if you can't afford that kind of commitment in terms of time, then a commercial venture might be for you. And so for only a couple of $100,000, a company like Virgin Galactic or XCOR would fly you from the sea level about 100 kilometers out to the Kármán line, where you would experience weightlessness. And there you would have the opportunity to look back at Big Blue against the blackness of space, experiencing that in weightlessness. Yes, and we'll get to the slide presentation in just a second, so we'll hold on this slide. And see that weightlessness, all for about 3 to 5 minutes before you return and transport it back to Earth. So what preparations are involved? Because I mentioned earlier, a non-commercial mission might be a commitment. Well, that would be about 9 to 12 months of training, maybe longer depending on the mission. Of course, in a commercial aspect, that's not as much. It's maybe a cardiovascular and neurological examination, and you're good to go. What are the risks? Well, in terms of risks regarding a commercial flight, not much. Basically, the cardiovascular and the neurological exam, and you're good to go. In terms of space, we want to consider that there are 2 points that are of interest. And that would be time, how long you're in space, and distance, how far away from the Earth you are. The further you are away from the Earth for the longer amount of time, the greater risk in exposure to radiation, bone density loss, and muscular atrophy. But at FoodWorx, we're concerned with food, which begs the question, why am I here talking with you? Well, back in the years of culinary school, I did my culinary internship at Johnson Space Center's Space Food Systems Laboratory with NASA, and some of my efforts included expanding the menu for the ISS, as well as working in their low-sodium initiative. But I could go on all day prattling about myself, so we won't do that. Instead, we'll talk a little bit and take a brief history of the history of space food. What's been going on in space food for the past 50 years? And if we could go to the next slide, please. It started with tubes and cubes in the early years, and I'll be brief because I do have some handouts for people that are interested. but we don't want to waste a lot of time. You can also find this information online. So it started with tubes and cubes. Basically, a tube was used with an adapter on the end because the astronaut would have their helmet on, and so of course was important to be able to provide the nutrition beyond the barrier of the helmet. The cubes were a little bit later as an invention, and that's basically a starch-derived basis, a gel that the food was protected in to avoid any crumbs from flying around. Next, please. And so this is basically what some of the early days of foods looked like at that time. So you could see that they were a little bit not recognizable in terms of foods that we see today. Next. And of course, in Skylab, which happened to be the most comprehensive kitchen that NASA had in space, they had a food warmer, and so you would be able to place your food in the warmer and keep things nice and to temperature. And they had next slide please, they had an actual dining table, which of course is a topic of discussion. I won't go into that topic today, but that's an entire discussion. This is at Johnson Space Center. This is a simulator, and the astronauts there are working to use the table and gain familiarity with it. There's not been a dining table since Skylab. Not on the shuttle, right? And so yeah, this also they had refrigeration and heating, and so it was a very refined, when we're talking about food, it was very sophisticated. Next, please. And so this is a tray, so you could see some of the items that might have been there. And I do happen to have some that I'll share as a visual aid as we go on, some of the items that, so we can see them more closely and see, feel, touch, and explore them. Next, you'll notice the M&Ms there, right? And they're recurring again. And so in this image, we see the silverware is actually magnetized to the tray so that it won't go floating around and being an issue. Next, please. Yes, there they are. They've been there since the early days of the wartime because, of course, NASA originally started as an extension of the military, and the M&Ms were melt in your mouth, not in your hands, and so it was a good idea in the military. That concept transferred into the space program, where, next slide, please, you'll find that it's become tradition for the astronauts to chase the M&Ms around in weightlessness, and they enjoy them. So it's evolved in terms of its meaning and its application, but they remain. Next, please. Speaking of cultural dimensions and thinking about traditions, we see some examples of the Russian foods. And next, please. And we'll notice that they enjoy their vodka, whether on Earth or in space. Next, please. This is an example of a modern-day food tray, and that's showing the various pouches that we don't use cans typically for our foods, although we do have the ability to produce in the cans, but we tend to like the pouches. And you'll see at the top that whitish portion that's opaque, that's a septum where the liquid delivery, the water delivery is added into the items. Next, please. And back one. That's a food warmer example, so that's how you might heat those items to bring them up to temperature. Next, we'll see astronaut Sandy Magnus in the background. She is America's first chef in space. That wasn't her intention, of course, as an engineer, and what she was working on was her own studies, but in addition to that, she decided to add an element of cooking, and the food warmer requires several stages, so it only heats for 15 minutes at an interval. And so after 2 hours, her garlic was cooked, and she was able to apply that to foods. And so you see her with some comrades there. Next, please. And this is what the astronauts love most, which would be their bonus packs, and those are the food items that come from the Earth to the astronauts, and it's in the natural form. Fresh produce, those items that are most perishable, of course, are consumed earliest on. And let's see, what things might we not see in space anytime soon in terms of food? Well, those things would be composed plates, So you probably won't see something with the chiffonade of fried basil or something like that. You probably won't see the garnish of microgreens, not yet anyway. You probably won't see things like empty calories, because of course it costs about $10,000 a pound to fly something into space, and therefore the items tend to be very nutrient packed. And so you won't see empty calories. The third item that you won't see, as I kind of alluded to earlier, but I'll explain why, would be the crumbs in space. And typically that's because in the weightless environment, you wouldn't want those to accidentally float into sensitive equipment, or of course they could become a hazard by flying into someone's eyes or someone flying into them, as well as somebody choking on that as well. So you don't want to have a lot of crumbs in the space environment. Next slide, please. These are some sources in the event that you should like to know a little bit more about food talk and some of the things that astronauts deal with in the thread of food. And next, please. I'd like to thank you for your time.